So you're listening to the Reinvention podcast. My name is Ben Redford, and today we'll be discussing the possibilities of decentralizing and democratizing manufacturing.
Hi everyone, I'm Kat Hayes.
And I'm Angela Bode, and we're joined by Ben today. Ben, where are you joining us from today?
I am joining us from my lovely little shed in the back garden of my house in South London, which is currently terrible weather as per usual.
Oh, same in Melbourne, actually.
Great.
Very similar indeed. Before we start and kick off today's episode, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather virtually today. Angela and I are on Wurundjeri land, which is part of Kulin country. We'd like to pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also for those on whichever land you are all on today. We'd also like to pay respect to elders of all other cultures present today.
Yeah, I can only second that. We were just discussing how much of a cool sort of ritual that is to start most of these meetings off on, and I can only second it and say, you know, thanks to all of the older generations that have come before me and looked after the world and let me do the things that I'm able to do today.
Great. So today we are so excited to dive in and discuss how mass manufacturing is not only filling up our landfills, like we know this, we see this all the time, but it's also changed how we value what we own. We're going to unpack what needs to change in order for us to all become creators again and bring to life our ideas and our passions and rethink some of those values. So we're really super excited to have Ben on the show with us today. Ben is an actual inventor. I think you're one of the first inventors I've ever met. And you're an awesome product designer. He's been part of many quirky and interesting Kickstarters, including Projecto, which is a tiny Instagram projector, and Internetopia, which I just absolutely adore. Everyone check this out on the show notes. Be part of the second phase of Internetopia, is that right? Like you calling on more people to be part of that?
Absolutely.
Which is really exciting. It's a beautiful art piece. In 2016, Ben and his colleague Alex Slemansky founded Mayku. Mayku offers a device called Boombox, which is a desktop vacuum former that lets you easily create products right in your home. Think of it as really, really accessible and affordable 3D printing. Mayku's mission is to provide everyday creators like you and me, everyone who loved working with Legos and Play-Doh as kids or paper, bring things to life. Mayku's products are used by creators across different industries, from the craft to the food industry. For example, creating molds for artisan chocolates. But what's the most unexpected sector or industry that you know have actually used a Boombox before?
It's a really good question. I think we've had an incredibly diverse range of different people that we did not expect to be using it at all. And I think the most exciting one for me as a sort of huge space geek was NASA. So we had it sort of pop up on one of our customers that this sort of at nasa.com email popped up, and we were like, whoa, okay. So we emailed them being like, hi, what are you using our machine for? And they were very cagey, but they did actually get back to us and said, we can't talk about it too explicitly, but it's something around growing plants with hydroponics in space. So I hope, space hydroponics, hopefully not the other kind of hydroponics, but it was very, that was just incredibly exciting. And I think, since lockdown, I've got really into gardening and stuff as well. So I'd really love to know what they're doing with it.
Yeah, that's so cool. And you've also had an early streak of fame when you appeared on a British breakfast show and created some unexpected excitement on Twitter, to say the least. Can you just tell us the story about this, Ben?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. So my first job out of university, I was working for a digital agency called Mint Digital, and I was a bit of a black sheep in that agency because I built them physical things. So I built them robots and little objects that were sort of experiments, and Projectio was one that I also built there as well. But one of our first projects was called Ollie and Polly, the web-connected robots. And so both Ollie and Polly were connected to Twitter, and depending on your sort of Twitter activity, they would either, Ollie would make a smell, and Polly would give you a sweet, like a gobstopper, or like a Malteser, or whatever it might be, depending on your Twitter activity. So if you searched a specific field term, or like you were mentioned, you could program it to, it'd sit next to your computer, and then when someone mentioned you on Twitter, or a certain field term came up, it would release a smell if it was Ollie, or it would release a sweet if it was Polly. And it was all about sort of trying to make on-screen digital interactions more physical, and stimulate more of the senses through sort of like nice, playful design. And we ended up winning the Young Inventor of the Year award for these little creations, which is quite funny. And part of the deal of accepting that award was that we had to go on this TV show, which is, it's kind of weird in the UK. It's called Sunday Brunch, and it's a live TV show that it's on for like 4 hours on a Sunday. It's like hangover TV. And you basically just switch it on, and there's like two guys, and they have guests come on, and they cook and they chat with people, and they taste wine and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so I had a little section on that, and so they were like, okay, can you bring the robots on? I was like, yeah, I'll bring the robots on. And I think probably about my 4th month at this new job, fresh out of university, so still trying to make a good impression, and very excited that I was taking the inventions that I'd made onto this TV program. And so they said, can you set it up? Can you set it up? And we're like, yeah, of course. So set it up, thinking that maybe 10 people might be watching this thing, and or 10 people might tweet about it. And a couple of gobstoppers would come out, because you can't see smell on TV. So anyway, we set it up with the hashtag Sunday Brunch Mint Digital, which was the two Sunday, and the company that I work for. Just being like, hello, this is, if you say this. Anyway, so as soon as we mentioned it, all of the gobstoppers poured out of Polly. And just like all over the floor, like within like 2 seconds, it was like all over the floor. And we were like, wow, okay, that's quite a lot. Anyway, my segment continued for another 3 or 4 minutes, and then I sort of exited the stage, and the producer ran up to me and was like, we're trending worldwide on Twitter. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, we're trending that hashtag is trending worldwide on Twitter. And I was just like, are you kidding me? And she was like, no, look. And she got off, and she showed me, and sure enough, like, top of the trending hashtags on Twitter was Mint Digital Sunday Brunch. And I was like, wow, that's amazing, like incredible. Gosh, I've nailed it. And then what I didn't realize, one of the dark sides of the interwebs, I guess, is that what happens when you start trending worldwide on Twitter is that pornography spam bots sort of attach themselves to your hashtag. So after a few minutes, like I was looking at this and was like, what is that picture? I'm not going to explain what the picture was, but it was Mint Digital, like Coco loves Rocco forever, and also loves just a string of obscenities, followed by @Mint Digital. And I was just like, oh my god. So it was, yeah. So I spent the rest of the morning sort of slightly concerned, but I remember walking into the studio on the Monday the next morning after, slightly, a little bit nervous about what's going on, and there was just like a slow clap as I walked in. I was just like, oh, okay, this is fine. But yeah, that was my first experience of sort of, the wins and the losses, I guess, of trending worldwide on Twitter as a young inventor, which was it's good fun looking back at it now.
That is so good. I love that. Sunday brunch. There you go.
That's it. Big TV show. Big in the game. Loved it.
Awesome. Well, before we launch into our chat, I thought I set a little bit of set the context a little bit. So we did a little bit of research. And what I wanted to do in order to kick us off was to actually wind back the clock and go back to the 18th century. And to be specific, look at the Industrial Revolution, which we all know and heard of. So the first Industrial Revolution, turns out there was many more. We witnessed a massive change from the handicraft economy to machine manufacturing. So the Industrial Revolution introduced major technological changes. So it made it possible for us to turn large amounts of natural resources into manufactured products in a much shorter period of time. But what I actually found a lot more interesting was that as part of the revolution, we decided to see socioeconomic and cultural changes as well. So things like wider distribution of wealth through increased international trade, as well as new work ethics and approaches. And which made, the revolution quite interesting as well. And as I mentioned, there was many more to follow from there. Now, winding the clock forward to the present day, here's a little experiment for everyone who's listening. Pick up the closest item that is either in front of you or close by, turn it over and check where it has been made. There's a pretty high chance it says that there's a small label that says it's been made in China. So what we're finding is a lot of the things that we buy, that we own, the things in our houses are actually made in China. And China is referred to the world's manufacturing superpower, and that for good reason. It accounted for 28% of the global manufacturing output in 2018. Now, to put that into perspective, that puts China more than 10 percentage points ahead of the United States, which used to have the world's largest manufacturing sector until China took over in 2010, so a decade ago. So, like with these mass production methods, we're seeing an abundance of consumer choices, or choices for consumers. And we're starting to see that it leads to that loss of individuality and a loss in quality as well. And I'm sure this has happened to all of us. We visit a friend or a family member, and we start to notice that we all own the same IKEA furniture, the same IKEA, coffee mug, the same IKEA, couch. It's all becoming a bit same. So to kick us right off, Ben, how is the current manufacturing process broken?
Oof. where to begin? Yeah, I mean, it's really great that we sort of start with that kind of historical context of where it's come from, because I guess from that moment forward, where you kind of had labor being mechanized, there has just been this sort of wholesale drive across the board, especially because capitalism, of this like massive focus on scale, and just like the more products, the more you can sell, the more profit, the better. The larger that you buy the sort of raw materials, which I think is a really interesting thing about when you start thinking about product. It's like you are sort of dragging all of these minerals and these materials out of the earth. It's not out of like nothing. It's very easy to forget that. And it's more like the more of those things you can drag out of the earth, the larger quantities that you can buy, and the greater number of these products that you can make, the more profit that you're going to make. And so that's like one side of it. And then there's always been this kind of weird dichotomy for me of sort of like, you need to make products at scale to increase the profit margins that you can make. And you also need to try and sort of guess how many that you're going to sell. And you want to try and order the maximum from a factory to make it cheaper, but then you don't know how many of those things you're going to sell. And for so long, it's been this kind of finger in the air, Like, oh, are we going to sell 50,000? And then if it doesn't work, it's just like, well, all of that energy, all of that labor, all of that, transformation of dead, crustaceans hundreds of thousands of years ago into this one little product that, before people you even get onto the sort of short use case for it, it's like, even if people buy it, right? So it's like, even before it's even been made, a lot of that stuff goes to waste. And I think that's just something that is, kind of the idea that you need to try and ascertain demand before you supply. And quite often you can get that wrong. And that's why we have market research groups and focus groups and all this kind of stuff. And they're quite often wrong as well. There's so many examples in history of just like products that have just flopped, right? Like huge amounts of backing, and they're just like, they put huge amounts of work and effort and make runs of thousands of them, and they just don't go anywhere. I think that's why it's also one of the cool things about what's come out of the web in particular is stuff like Kickstarter. Like, people never talk about Kickstarter being this really interesting tool for understanding the demand for something before putting any effort into making it. Which is, I just think it's a really efficient way of doing it. It's like, do you want this? Yes, great, okay. And I think you're starting to see that a lot better. But yeah, if we're just focusing on the sort of the bits that are and sort of could be fixed with manufacturing at the moment, I think that's one huge thing, is the sort of contrast between needing mass scale and people not knowing how much of that mass scale people want, and not being able to supply all of the people, obviously, so that making an incredible amount of waste, and then this sort of idea that you basically just chase the cheapest labor. So inherently, just like by the fact that if you're making large quantities of stuff, you need to chase the cheapest labor around the world to increase your profit margins, because sort of capitalism and there's this idea that sort of developing economies use a manufacturing base as a way to sort of rise. You've seen it in the West in particular since the sort of first industrial revolution. That's where all our sort of, or a great deal of our wealth and our development came from. And then it becomes this sort of dirty word, where you don't want to be manufacturing anymore. You want a service industry, because that's somehow more admirable. And the States, just like you said before, they were the powerhouses, and then they sort of rose up, and now China is the powerhouse, and they're like rising up to the top. And it's this thing that everyone piggybacks on and then uses and then switches. And it's kind of, it's just a very strange process where we kind of use the labor force of people to elevate our nations to a state where then we can be like, oh no, we're better than that now, so we'll move all of our labor everywhere else that is somewhere cheaper. And it's just something that's never really spoken about. And it's
moving the labor somewhere we can't see it.
Exactly.
Just hiding it,
I think that really ties into one of the big things, is that we don't have that sort of connection with how things are made anymore. And I think that's such an important part of like an appreciation and a valuing of objects, that because we sort of obfuscate the way that something is made, it's also much more mysterious in our eyes, which makes us both feel like we tend to fetishize objects much more. Like the whole sort of like the latest technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? Like when you saw an iPhone for the first time, you were like, oh my gosh, like that is like, what is that? The little glowing rectangle, and you think about the effect of that, and that just feels like this sort of impenetrable object. It's just like we don't we don't understand how it's made, and I think it renders us kind of weirdly powerless to be able to fix stuff, to be able to like have an understanding of how something's made, like the very sort of deep intricacies of what the tools are that you're using. It just feels like you should be able to empower yourself to know how to make them yourself.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it makes me think, you know, you were saying, you know, you have to manufacture at scale. So if I have an idea around something that I want to, you know, spin up and I want to get it manufactured, I would have to get it manufactured in bulk for me to justify the cost. And there's nowhere, you know, people would even consider that. So I'm sure that means, you know, so many people have great ideas around, you know, concepts and ideas, and never being able to see them through because they hit the roadblock of, well, I'm never going to be able to get this manufactured now. And it just ends up sitting in a drawer. A good idea just disappears into, you know, the top drawer, and then it stays on a piece of paper, which is really sad to see.
That's it. That's exactly it. And I mean, I just think it would be, if anything, just so much more interesting, like a place if you weren't beholden to having to make, like, it shouldn't be that an idea has to be acceptable to hundreds of thousands of people, which is always the question that you get. It's like, you know, what's the market size? It's a classic thing, and it's like, I understand why the mechanisms of that, I'm not saying that's like a terrible thing, I understand why the mechanisms of that exist, because profit, and that makes sense. But the idea that so many of those concepts that people have, and like, you know, sort of products of the imagination, which are quite often wonderful, just don't exist because of that very simple fact, is that somebody's decided that the market size isn't big enough, or you know, there's not enough of an economy of scale to be able to manufacture it. It's just really, it's quite sort of sad in a way. I guess as an inventor or a product designer, it's like, I'd love to see that world where people are empowered to be able to make their own stuff and not have to make them in the hundreds of thousands to be able to do that.
Exactly. And you know, you pointed out something really interesting around, you know, the mystery of creating something, you know, seeing something transform from, you know, a natural resource, whether it's a piece of wood or another type of resource, and seeing it go through that, you know, transformation phase or stages, and trying things out. Maybe things don't go quite according to plan, but then you learn something new along the way. Like, we've all been there where we've tried to do something. We've tried to bake something and it didn't quite work out the way we wanted to.
Yeah, sure.
You're discovering something along the way, and you're like, all right, that will work. So with that sense of mystery and that sense of, I guess, transformation, when people start to, I guess, allow their imagination to have a bit of a free flow, I suppose, and that not happening as much anymore. How does that change how people value things and objects?
I mean, I'm a firm believer in the fact that I think that things that you have made yourself, you value very differently, or things that that your loved ones have made in particular, like you value in a different way to, you know, the latest gizmo or electronic, or, you know, purchase from Amazon that turns up and you may use for a couple of hours, and then it's like, oh, that's not very good. And I think that idea comes from there is something about, like, someone that you know and love making something for you is more about the intangible gesture of that thing, even though it might be a completely useless thing. It's like, it's something really lovely about the fact that, you know, you're using the wooden spoon that your uncle carved for you, or your aunt. You know what I mean? Like that sort of idea that there's like a potter, and it's, there's the human touch in something And being able to see that and feel that is there's something a lot warmer, I guess, about the, you know, your interaction with that object, rather than this kind of what is quite often perceived as kind of cold and industrialized. I mean, I'd love to see. I think that comes down to the sort of kind of Marxist idea of you know, who owns the kind of means of production, right? It's like, who owns the tools that enable you to build those kind of cold objects, mass manufactured objects, compared to something that is made by hand, which is usually the things that you love. But I don't know, I'd be so interested to see kind of folk electronics, if that makes sense, or like folk products that are that are more kind of made for a specific use by like a local person. I'd just love to know what a sort of folk iPhone looks like, right? It's like, it's just such a sort of, because it feels like strange and uncomfortable in my head, and I think that's quite nice. You know what I mean? It's like I think you do see kind of the whisperings of it on the internet with maker culture and you know, 3D printers and laser cutters and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting place to be going down, where the lovely thing about it as well is they're probably not going to be they're not going to be amazing at the first instance, right? They're always the way with like early prototypes, and just like those kind of objects when people are just experimenting quite freely, because they are being exposed to those processes as well. You know, if you have access to tools, that for me, I don't know about anyone else, but it's like, you know, even something as simple as like a pencil, right? No, it's like a cliche, but it's a pencil, a piece of paper. It does drive your sort of imagination to come up with stuff. And I think that should be exactly the same with like an injection molding machine. You know what I mean? Like this, just because it's a massive piece of industrial equipment, I think just giving people access to those tools is just a really interesting thing to do, and a lot of what Mayku is based on. And you know, the whole Earth catalogue is a really good example of this, which is like Stuart Brand and a couple of the guys back in the 60s, sort of pre-internet, just a whole catalogue based on access to tools. And it was just like here's this monthly book about all of the coolest tools that are out there, just because it did do that thing of like, it gave people the ideas and the imagination to make their own stuff,
I like
which I think
that.
is a really cool thing to do. Yeah.
It's it almost feels like a little bit of a generational thing as well, because if I think of my dad, for example, less about making something but more around repairing. So my dad will never throw anything out. If something is broken, he will find a new use for it. Like if it's a kitchen knife and the blade is broken off and all you have left is the handle, he will find a use for it. You know, either he'll try and fix it or you'll make something new out of it. And this generational thing of, I'm not going to throw anything out. I'm just going to, this is precious, and I'm going to give it a new life form of some kind. Which means also the house is full of lots of random things every time I go.
Tell me about it.
But it's that appreciation where like every object, you know, has a role to play. And it's interesting to see how like our generation now, it's become more of a throwaway culture. You know, it's like, oh, something's broken, I'm going to chuck it in the bin. I'll just buy it. I'll just buy it something new because it's cheap. I can buy it pretty much in any store. And it changes your relationship, you know, with the things that you have in your house. Everything starts to become replaceable, which is a little bit scary. While, you know, when someone comes over and, you know, now, you know, we've been in lockdown in Melbourne for quite a while, and we've kind of been doing a little bit of a food exchange with some friends. Like we take turns like, baking and cooking and, you know, things like that. And even if it's not a perfect tray of cookies, like, because they made it and they put love into it, you know, it's just like, you just appreciate that so much more. Or if someone, you know, made something for you, like you were saying, it has that warmth and that love and there's a gesture. It's just, it's something you will keep forever on your bookshelf. And you know, people don't quite understand. They're like, oh, what is that? What is that? What is that wonky wooden spoon doing in your drawer? Like, oh, that's my favorite spoon to cook with.
Exactly. It's this whole, like, it's this whole thing about the thought that counts. You know, it's the thought that counts when someone makes you that really weird mug. Or those strange cookies that they drop off at your door, Angie. And it feels like with this mass manufacturing system, the thought has been, we've been robbed of that thought. It's kind of like that thought has been hiding, or it's been taken away from us, because when I think about that, like that love and care and connection that you were just talking about now, that warmth that is given to something, that is still given to the things that we interact with every day. A lot of the time, there's a lot of thought that's gone into an iPhone. There's a lot of love and blood and sweat and tears, but we're just not connected with that at all. And so, you know, with that not being part of understanding that, and understanding like how meaningful that was for that person that created to make it, we just don't have that connection to it. And it's also robbing us of that imagination and that creativity and the thought that went into something, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So with, you know, like with the current situation that we're in, you know, global pandemic, COVID-19, have you observed any shifts and changes in how people are relating to the things that they own, or, you know, sparks of imagination or creativity?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a sort of silver lining, I guess, for Mayku. Like, horrendous situation for the whole planet to be in. But I think because people are at home, or have been spending more time at home in lockdown, and they've been focusing more on what they want to do to an extent, and their hobbies and making stuff at home. And a lot of that has ended up in them, you know, and also, you know, sadly, from the sort of kind of economic side of things, a lot of people are losing jobs, right? And so they're looking into other means of making incomes, and quite often that's like, oh, I'm going to do that, my side hustle, you know, which might be sort of making bath bombs or soaps, or, do you know what I mean? Just like that thing that you love doing, or like or cookies or whatever. So we've had a big explosion of people getting form boxes, which is the products that we build, and making their own stuff with it, and setting up little businesses to, you know, whether it's just like a side hustle hobby business, to sort of pass the time whilst they're in on furlough, as we have it over here, or you know, whilst they're waiting to go back to their jobs, in comparison to like people who have gone full steam. It's just been like, no, I'm not going back. This is my thing now. And that's just like, I love that, you know. I love some of the stories that you hear of people just being like, yeah, I quit my job and now I make stuff on Boomboxes. You're just like, what? That is amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I think I love the responses to crises that humans have. You know, I think that's something, there is so much joy to be had in those moments of darkness, and like, especially when that ends up in creativity. You know, it's like so cool to see how people will respond and sort of pick themselves up and be like, no, I'm gonna make bath bombs that look like you know, my favorite video game characters. And then suddenly they're selling 300 a week, and it's just like, what? Like, okay, but yeah, it's really cool. And I think the more of that, you know, because I think that is it's one of the things that has been affected is that kind of the mass scale supply chains and you know, of the sort of global manufacturing infrastructure have been really adversely affected. And it's weird because we've been sort of banging the drum of local manufacture for 4.5 years, and it's kind of only taken a global pandemic for people to be like, oh, like
it's so interesting.
That's a thing.
Yeah, because this was like the first thing people noticed. It was the like biggest impact on them was like, oh wow, there's no toilet paper. There's no toilet paper. There's no flour. Oh my God, there's a supply chain. What is that? You know, oh, they've got to like, suddenly they become aware that there's a system behind things and things just don't magically appear on the shelves. It became really apparent, didn't it?
Yeah. And I think sorry.
Oh no, you go.
Yeah, I think that's the that sort of transparency or you know, sudden awareness of how all of your things are made and get to where you usually sort of consume them was just like a massively fascinating thing for a lot of people. And so the rise in sort of vegetable growing was amazing. I don't know if you had the same thing in the States, but London, it was just like everyone grows vegetables now, because that was just like, it was just so weird. And it's something that's really been kept up, and I think that's really, really wonderful. That suddenly people understand that there's earth and there's seeds and there's water and there's, you know, not that they didn't understand how plants grow before, but they have a much more visceral, I mean, me personally have a much more sort of visceral understanding of like what it means to tend to things, and, you know, like the fight with, and how much effort, right? Like how much effort and labor that goes into your carrot that comes out like 2 centimeters long, and it's like but then you know, the pumpkin that is, you know, the size of your head, and you're like, whoa, it's so magical, and like I think that's really cool. And yeah, I think that hopefully that will be something that is kept going forward. Yeah, it's just an interesting one.
Yeah, it's almost like our sense of accomplishment has shifted a little bit. You know, before accomplishment had to be grand and large numbers and had to be significant, and now sense of accomplishment is, hey, I sold, you know, 50 bath bombs, you know, to my neighbor, you know, or I managed to grow a carrot, like, and you're so proud of that, and you're more likely to share those successes than the other stuff that we used to, you know, like put a lot of value on as well, and which actually no one really cared about. But if you tell someone about, you know, your homemade bath bombs and the process you went around experimenting the right level of, I don't know, they're quite fizzy, aren't they, a bath bomb? I've never actually
you should try it, they're really fun.
Okay, I will. But like, you know, getting that just right, you know, going through that process, it must be so exciting, because I think everyone, you know, you see it with kids as well. Like kids love to, you know, try things out and like be little inventors. Like I remember sitting in my basement and like putting all these like random like things together into a bowl. Like I would find washing powder and then like pour in like Coke. Oh my God, the whole thing is an explosion.
That's like Angie, that is like a bath bomb, essentially.
There you go. Oh my God, I was way ahead of the time then.
It's so good.
But it's like, we're all inventors at one point, you know. And we've kind of lost that out because we feel like accomplishment needs to look and needs to be a certain scale, I suppose. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. And you know, accomplishments can be small as well and can be more meaningful that way. Yeah, nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more around what inspired you to kind of take action, and like what was your first step to say, you know what, manufacturing is broken. We need to look at how we can do this differently.
So it was funny because it was actually by building my first product in China. So I was actually out there and saw all of the sort of amazing machinery that they had in the factories out there and the infrastructure that they had. And it was kind of around the time of when 3D printing was really sort of kicking off and getting into the mainstream, and somebody called it 3D printing rather than stereolithography, which is like its sciencey name, and suddenly everyone was like, 3D printing, yeah, it's amazing. And then and yeah, it was as really sort of on that hype curve as that was rising, and I was out in China, and just, you know, the excitement of that time, you know, sort of 2011, 2012, really stuck with me, because I was there and just realized that all of these huge machines in these factories in China are all huge because of that scale question that we were talking about before. But most of them can be a lot smaller. You know, there's not that much to sort of miniaturize. If you want to take something and make it like a big machine and make it smaller, it just produces stuff in small batches, and that's fine, right? Like that's just like, as soon as you remove that idea from your head that it has to be big because you need to make thousands, it was just a bit of a sort of, you know, that was the kind of light bulb moment where it was like, what? It's mad that I had to fly 3,000 miles across the world, whatever, to come here to get this thing made, to then fly it to somewhere else and where it's going to be packaged, and then like fly it somewhere else where it's going to be consumed, and then where it's probably going to be used for a couple of years or whatever, and then it's probably going to go in a container ship back to China.
Oh my God.
Right? And it's just because that's where so much of our waste went for such a long time, and now they're just like, no more. And it's just, I think that was just like seeing when it all sort of clicks together, and you're like, well, if you just make stuff closer to home, does that not just really shorten all of this kind of unneeded, like understandably sort of socio-political structures that have been built up over many, many years between like countries wanting to develop and you know, their infrastructures and all of the like tangles that involved? It just felt like a very elegant like mission to sort of take on, and one that was meaningful to me as well, because it was so close to, you know, my beliefs about making stuff and having people have a close relationship to how things are made and repaired. And I think that was just a really, it was definitely like an enlightening period of like doing factory tours in China. It was just like, wait a minute, what? This is crazy. And it's interesting because what I think, just to go back a little bit to what we were talking about on the sort of pandemic, like post-pandemic side of things, is that China now are very, very much focused on their own market, right? So they're very much inwardly looking and looking to try and generate their own that income, that sort of economic wealth from their own market, because they've got a burgeoning middle class who have more and more disposable income, and so they're doing it, right? They're now the ones that are like, our manufacturing is now all local because we've got the infrastructure that we've been building for the rest of the world, and so it's actually, and you know what they're saying about 2050 and the emissions, you know, like them being able to do that and act swiftly upon that, because they have all of the manufacturing infrastructure there to be like, we don't need to ship stuff thousands of miles across the world, because we can make stuff for our own market. Exactly. And it's like, it's a funny shift in how that's happened, from essentially just being, you know, the manufacturers for the world to the manufacturers for China. It's like, there you go. And just all of those loops, I guess, being much smaller. And that's not to say that I think in my personal experience, because there is such a like an incredible like knowledge base of how to make things there, from people that have been doing it for many years. It's like, and to an extent, it's not like local manufacturing is a very old idea, right? It's like pre-industrial revolution sort of cottage industries. People used to make, you would have your blacksmith, you would have your potter, your ceramicist, all in a small village, right? And all of the stuff would be made within a couple of kilometers or miles of where it was consumed. And it's just an interesting idea that we could be going back to that, not as in like a step backward, let's all go and live off the land way, because I don't think it's not feasible for us to suddenly all become sort of farmers again or anything like that, because there's a global population of billions of people. But the idea that we can take what the advancements in technology that development has allowed us to do, and bring it closer to home is just it's quite, it's exciting, and it's hopeful, and it's empowering to people, I think. And I think that's where it sort of all came from. And I think providing people with the tools to be able to do that is just a really cool thing to do. Like, I think it's exciting. Does that answer the question? I think that's roundabout way of saying it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, I'm okay. So I'm going to hit you with a really big question now, because we've been talking about like the demand, the supply side of things, right? So like, the manufacturing journey that you talked about, and what a potential future might look like, where we kind of revisit the values that we had living in those little villages. So many people have their namesake in, those who've got British ancestry around those times, the potters and the tailors and the smiths have all come from them. That's the supply side of things. Let's look at the demand side of things. So here it is. Here's a big question. For you, what needs to change in order for people to wake up and move away from consumerism? Because we can all agree that that's a massive problem. Just a little question for you. From your perspective, what do you think needs to change here?
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because it's like, I guess it's like a terminology thing as well. Like I think there's a sort of there's consumerism, which is like how we perceive, what we've been talking. It's like how we tag what we've been talking about, with like mass manufacturing and huge supply chains, and that is generally perceived to be bad, right? It's like making stuff and someone else producing something and someone else consuming it, and all of the miles and the labor and the energy in between that is seemingly a very inefficient way of doing stuff. There's a really interesting idea by a guy called Alvin Toffler, of the prosumer, which is, I'm sure you've probably like heard of. It's like people who both produce and consume the things that are needed. So the prosumer idea is like a really cool one. And I think I can imagine that being a good step sort of forward in people being able to, but I think the idea that, everyone should just produce everything for themselves and for themselves only, is kind of flawed, because you're not going to get the sort of diversity and the intrigue and that kind of what we were talking about before, of like other people being able to make interesting things of the imagination. Like, I don't think it should be individualized to that extent, but yeah, I think it kind of comes down to sort of community as well, I guess, and like the very human aspects of that, which we have lost as well to an extent, but I think was weirdly coming more to the forefront in the pandemic, right? Like I've never been so in touch with my neighbors, and like I think if those two things can coexist in a more sort of local, urban, and rural to an extent, you know, like environment where there is much more production on a local scale from people that are able to provide the Smiths and the, you know, all of the namesakes of those, but maybe it's you know, Felix Electronics Engineer is not, doesn't have the same ring to it in terms of a surname, but you know, like I think it's yeah, I don't know, it's like I can see that being something that would be both incredibly valuable to people and also, like, to an extent, something that is anti the kind of tech giant monopoly, kind of anti Amazon. Package arrives on your doorstep, you don't have a clue where it's been made or where it's come from, and you don't know who's delivered it. Maybe that's very, very, I mean, it is very idealistic, but it feels possible, and like I said before, you do see the sort of whisperings of it, both online and in a sort of local sense. I mean, the explosion in particular in London of sort of kind of hipster ceramic classes. I don't know if you've got it in Australia, but it's just like, it's easy to be sort of dismissive of that, but I think it's really wonderful. It's amazing that people are like making those things, and like maker spaces, hacker spaces, these places where like the slightly more advanced place, like I think it's just still really, really interesting places for the community to come together and understand how to make stuff. And you know, to an extent, food is a very similar thing, right? Like we talk about food in comparison a lot of and it's got a lot of similar analogies as well, because like, okay, food mouths is something we've talked about, but we don't talk about that with products. It's also something that brings people, like cooking food brings people together so much, and restaurants have that sort of focus on you know, particularly good ones, or not good one, but like ones that are interesting. So many of them seem to have such a focus on local produce. You know, like Noma in Copenhagen, which is like, you know, one of the most famous ones in the world, like supposed to be the best, and it's literally just like you can't source any ingredients outside of this country. And it's not a nationalistic thing, it's just the belief in constraints, I think, is a really important thing as well, where you're like, yeah, this is the so it's not just so like you can do anything, yeah, there is sort of restraints, which is like, yeah, you can only do stuff outside it.
Because, you know, like you were saying with food miles, it's really interesting how people have become a lot more aware, you know, of the fact that, you know, eat what's in season, eat locally, like that conversation seems to be, you know, happening a lot more in the community these days, but less so with products. Like we're not seen as concerned, you know, how many miles this item that I've bought, you know, whatever it might be, this, you know, my running shoes, right? Wherever my running shoes have come from, it doesn't really matter. But if I'm standing in the supermarket and,
true.
You know, if I really want to buy kiwis, this happened to me. I really wanted to buy kiwis because I had a craving for kiwis, which I often do. And, you know, being in Australia, like they come from New Zealand, which is not that far away. But these kiwis came from Italy. And I was like, oh, well, I was like, what do I do? Like, do I follow my craving, or do I give in and like buy this kiwi that has traveled halfway across the globe? and the I actually calculated the miles. I'm going to look it up. So this is the food miles calculator online, where you basically a way to kind of measure the carbon footprint of an item that has traveled around. I think you might be able to do with products maybe as well.
Cool.
So if I would have bought that kiwi from Italy and it would have traveled all the way to Melbourne, it would have had 16,229 kilometers for one little item. I mean, there would have been a tray of kiwis, obviously, but we don't seem to have that same rationale when we're like at the Nike store buying our runners, because we're like, well, of course it's going to come from China. What difference is it? While with food, we seem to somehow have that understanding.
It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I could literally talk about this idea all day. Like, it's such a mad thing. I think it's something to do with for me, it's like, or for when I sort of observe people's perceptions of it, it's like there's something about how often you do it as well. It's like how often you consume it. So it's like, okay, so my Nike running shoes, I might buy a pair a year, so that's fine, right? And it's like, that's okay for that to come to China, but like my kiwis, which I might eat once a month, that's not okay. And it's like, where's the line, right? Where's the bit where you're like, okay, then there's some things that I have which are allowed to come from further, and there's some things that I suddenly feel very not okay with. It kind of goes on to the whole thing, which I always have a bit of a kind of internal debate with in my head about, like, minimalism versus kind of being able to make stuff, right? It's like, I'm a firm believer that you should just have very few things that you like and that you value as objects, except books. Books are my one sort of like, nope, there's gonna be loads of books. And then, but yeah, it's a kind of similarly related thing where, you know, on the one hand, you want people to build stuff, but it is completely diametrically opposite to this idea of scale, and, you know, building many things and owning many things, in terms of consumerism as well, because that's, you know, it's more, right? It's always more. And there's some very interesting brands who are, you know, very open about the fact that you should buy less of their stuff, and that's why it's more expensive. Noah is a really good example of this. Noah NYC, like X sort of skater brand, and all of their shirts are expensive, right? But it's like, oh yeah, it's expensive because it's been made in Italy by a family that have been making cotton 200 years, and it's going to last you till you die. So it's fine that it's, you know, $400. And I think, yeah, there's always been a sort of thing in my head that I've never really been able to like solve, of like, do you buy much less and keep all of that stuff for a longer period of time, or do you focus completely and solely on like more the like recyclability of the thing, so you can use it for the time that you need it? And it's just like, well, yeah, there's options, there's like, you know, there's solutions to both of those things, and there's both are kind of okay, you know. But sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. It sounds like a really key like theme around people's mindsets needing to change. I'm thinking about Angie's dad as well. When I say this, is resourcefulness.
Yeah.
You know, being just like a fundamental value. Because whether because you were talking about constraints being such a key part of creativity and imagination. It's, you know, talk to any designer, talk to any artist, and they'll always say constraints are really great for creativity because, you know, they provide those boundaries.
Exactly.
And when I think about like the tension that you're talking about between minimalism and making your own, I guess one of the commonalities is the resourcefulness piece.
Absolutely.
You know,
yeah.
between those two things.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the really good. And again, it's like one of those things that, like Angie's dad, I'm assuming sort of is a sort of a post-war generation. I'm making a massive assumption there about like your dad.
Correct.
Yeah, but like there's there's that sort of inherent we will find a way and we'll make it work. Which I think has been another one of those kind of values of resourcefulness that has kind of been lost in a funny way. It's I think that is born of, and when you talk to older generations as well, and they're just like, you've got it all, you've like, it's all at the all. There's that, I can't remember who said it, but that whole thing about like everything is amazing and no one's happy, right? It's like this idea that you've got everything at your fingertips, and it's like there's a kind of there's too much of it to actually have everything that is meaningful. And also, when you do something really resourcefully, incredibly satisfying when you nail it and you're like, that was really great.
I mean, just going back to food,
when you sort of hustle and
like if you buy a really great piece of meat, or even if you buy a loaf of bread and you have like the crust left over, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to make soup from this, or I'm going to make bread out of this, and I'm going to use that, and then you're like, I've used all of it, and there's like that really satisfying feeling of being the master of the thing, There's another theme that we were talking about when it comes to like some interesting changes that we're seeing, that we're all witnessing as part of a global change, and that is valuing diversity. So we were talking about, it made me think about when you were talking about like the ceramic workshops that are now like growing crazy in the UK. They're definitely huge here in Melbourne. Melbourne's, probably second after Denmark and Copenhagen being a hipster capital. I don't know. But we can debate about that for a while. But basically, the thing that people love about that is it's celebrating diversity, right? Not everything looks the same. Angie was just saying, like you come to my house and you'll see the same IKEA mugs that Angie is drinking from today. Exactly the same.
I know. That's so embarrassing.
But we're seeing like the sameness thing, the standardization, scale, like value, emotional value being stripped away, system that we're in now, and us starting to favor being more excited about the things that are different, the things that are unique, the quirky things, the love and care that has gone into something specific. I'll pay more for that because I understand that that's different and this is unique and I'm the only one that owns this thing. We're seeing that like valuing of diversity being much more important when we see big global movements like Black Lives Matter, like LGBTQ, and making sure that people feel included as also being something that is straying away from that sameness stuff. Just kind of opening it up,
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can always. It's like the objects that you like. I think you can always see the kind of intangible cultural movements that are going on, kind of baked into the objects that we create. In a weird sense, like our material culture is usually. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like when you look into the past, that's how we understand what was going on. Particularly this sort of prehistory, like before writing, we look at the objects and then we say, oh, that's what was, we take readings from them. And that tells us what that society was like. And I think that's exactly the same thing as sort of what's going on now is like the explosion in all of, like in kind of social movements that we're going through, and the struggle, from BLM and LGBTQ communities that are like really pushing all of this stuff. I think the kind of material artifacts that are going to exist from this time will be like the things that we look at and say like that existed because of this thing. And I think that's just, you know, there is such a wealth of information we can glean from those objects as well. And yeah, I don't know, it's just it fascinates me that those kind of cultural movements can be like codified into things, and folk objects, and you know how we perceive them. Yeah, it's super interesting.
I love it. So, in terms of like reinventing a space, because that's what you're doing. I mean, as an inventor, you know, with your story about like, I can't believe I'm flying all over the world for this thing. And we're just talking about food miles or production miles. You know, what is core to reinvention for you? Because it's been a journey. What would you say is the thing that's kept you going?
I think I'm in like an incredibly sort of privileged position, in as much as I think seeing, because it's always like a dream, right? At the start, you're like, I've got this idea that Alex and I had, where we're like, okay, this is the mission that we're sort of going to go on. We're going to try and get more people to make their own thing, so that they, because we hold this sort of fundamental belief. And then we sort of toiled away at it for 2 years before we sort of like actually had a machine that was ready to sort of come off a production. And yes, the irony is not lost on me that we make stuff. We don't make our machines locally. But like, yeah, we toiled away at this thing for 2 years. And then I think the thing that sort of keeps it going for me is that, you know, every day I get up and I sort of check Slack, and someone else has posted like another thing that people have made using our machines, that has somehow sort of like either changed their life like a tiny bit or to a huge extent. But it's just like, it's really satisfying for me as an inventor to be building a machine that enables other people to build stuff. Because it's like a very self-fulfilling sort of circle. It's like, it's not just like, oh, someone used my spoon. It's like, oh, this is, you know, they've gone off and done their own thing with it that I could just never have imagined ever doing, right? Like, and that's just really, really, yeah, that's definitely like a really satisfying thing that keeps on pushing you forward. And when I know it sounds really weird, but I love it when people come to me with like problems, you know, and they're like, listen, I'm a chocolatier, and when I make I'm trying to make these chocolates and I need it to do this, and then you're like, oh, okay, cool. So like, if I help you to do this, then that like pushes it a little bit further, and then those things get sort of baked into the next machine, or to an accessory. Like we've got it's very sort of niche and geeky, but we've got an accessory coming out sort of next month. It's just being produced at the moment, which was from a hack of one of our users. One of our users wanted to melt down milk bottles. I don't know if you have the same milk, but we have LDP milk bottles over here. So like kind of milky, semi-translucent color. It's like recyclable and plastic. And then they couldn't get our machine hot enough. So they made this little sort of cardboard and tinfoil oven for it that they then put it on and sort of surrounded it. And they sent me a video of it being like, look, I made this, and it helps you to make milk bottles. And I was just like, you know, like, this is so good. Like, it's so good because it enables you, it opens up the possibilities of like more engineering-y types of material, and like just more even materials that need higher amounts of heat. And it's amazing to think that, you know, we're a small company, we're 15 people, but we've got 6,000 users out there, that are not only making their own stuff, but just sort of like tinkering with the machine as well, and making all of these little bit. And some of those end up, you know, they're like, this is a thing. And we're, you know, obviously we're very like, this is amazing. Do you mind if we make it? And they're like, yeah, 100%, like go for it, because that is, I think, part of the like maker culture as well. And get like open source culture, and you know that which is very much where I sort of came from. It's just a very fascinating thing where I think it always keeps me excited and keeps me, you know, interested in building the next thing. Because it does feel, and that is massively enabled by the web as well. Like that just wouldn't happen without us being able to see what people can make on there. So yeah, I think that's where it definitely keeps me going and keeps me excited.
Yeah, it's so great because it creates a community of innovators, you know, that you start to realize that anyone can, you know, as we've been talking about this, you know, doing the entire show, it's like anyone can do something, like anyone can make a bath bomb, it turns out. And it kind of makes me think, and this is a question that I have for you, is if we were to start to look into the future, like future, and, you know, more and more people feel, you know, enabled and empowered to let out their inner innovator, or to be more creative and actually start to fulfill some of their ideas. Like what best possible outcome can we see from a change like this? Like what ripple effect can we start to see in perhaps society or in systems out there?
Oh. It's all, yeah, I mean, it's always, I mean, there's always, usually with these sort of questions, there's always like other precursors to it that have kind of gone before. So like I'm not sort of comparing ourselves to Apple in any way, but if you think about it as like an analogy of a camera being a tool of production, right? Because you're creating images, and the sort of explosion in photography from Instagram, essentially, is providing a platform, but Instagram is it's a distribution platform for a camera, and a camera is the hardware that enables. It just happens to enable both of those things. But I think that is like a, you know, putting a sort of a really, really, really amazing image machine in people's pockets, that both enables people to produce and consume those images. It's just a really, like, if you think about the ripple effect that's had on society, how much that's changed. It's like, and yeah, it's never like making objects is never going to be as popular as images, because it's like, you know, it's something that everyone does, and it goes back to that thing of like, what's a mass thing that people can really, and what are the sort of societal movements that have enabled that to become a thing, you know, a very image-based culture, and it's like a medium that is very easy to share, whereas physical stuff is more difficult because it requires its own, even small supply chains. You know, you still need to get the chocolate drops to people, which come from a cocoa tree, which then they can enable them to make their chocolate. But it's a super interesting analogy, I think, as being like what that's done and how that's empowered many people in terms of them building their own businesses and having, you know, it's crazy when you think about it, that you can basically have an Instagram account. And I know influencers get a bad rep, but what an amazing, you know, like the fact that entire industries have boomed just from, and that is just a tiny example, but the amount of industries that have just flourished from, you know, a tool being made accessible to someone in as much as like an iPhone, right? And it's just like, it's producing an image, and people have been able to build their own stuff from it completely. And I think kind of what we were going back to before, with there is so much other opportunities around, if you take a step back from it just being around manufacturing, but just around production, right? Like production and consumption, which is like the sort of abstract of this whole conversation. Is like, what happens if Mayku starts making tools that help people grow stuff, right? Like more like industrial growing, which is how a lot of us consume our vegetables that we were talking about before, and like all of the. What happens if you start to miniaturize down that technology? So for people vast amounts of people, especially in London, who haven't had a garden over lockdown and have more than likely been really pissed off by all of these privileged people who have got, nice gardens and that they have access to, right?
I'm one of those people. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like it must be so frustrating, because it's like, oh yeah, I grew my carrots, and they're like, yeah, I've got a windowsill, Yeah. And so it's just, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity of like what happens when you start to look at it, not just from like, because not everyone wants to make stuff, right? Not everyone wants, and there's only so many soap and bath bombs and chocolates that the world needs before we need to start being like, okay, what are the other, like, what are those more familiar things, right? Like, what are the more what are the things that people use that they need on a day-to-day basis?
Essential things as well,
like
exactly.
More self-sustainable. Like, that's not a bad thing, giving people the tools to be able to do that quite easily as well.
Yeah. That's it. And I think that's, there's a it goes back to the very start of this conversation with like NASA. If you're in space trying to grow vegetables, you don't have a garden, right? It's like, and it's to a weird extent, there's a lot of people that aren't too sort of dissimilar from that kind of, like, you've got an apartment, and everyone's like, yeah, you should grow your own veg, it's really satisfying, and it's like, where? On what earth what planet do you, like, how do you understand my lived experience? And I think there's for me, there's just like, it's like the tip of the iceberg for Mayku. It's like starting with a set of manufacturing machines, but like, where else are the really need-based things that we can start to have an effect on, and that's a future, I think, that really excites me and has could potentially have an amazing impact on the rest of society.
It almost allows people to go back to their roots a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
I also think that, like, the whole culture around making that you were talking about, open source, collaboration, do you mind if we make this so other people can have access to your cool idea? Imagine if there was a world where, because we're just talking about things being hidden, the magic behind something being hidden in the current system that we have versus a really transparent and open one.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where that was happening, where there was diversity of creation, diversity of creativity, and also a lot more transparency.
Absolutely. And it's all, I think it would be so good. It's like the sort of the means, mode, opportunity, it's all there, right? It's like there's the means to do it, there's like the sort of cultural frameworks there for it to exist, and the technologies are there for exist, and the demand as well, to an extent, for people to have access to all of this stuff is really important. There's an amazing open source farming project, which has got it teaches you how to build all of the machinery for farming, which is just I think it's just called open source agriculture, I think is what it's called. But it teaches you how to make a tractor, right? But using very simple tools and materials that you can just get from a metalworking shop, and like a mechanized plow. And if you think about the effect that a mechanized plow had on, the first agricultural revolution, it's just huge, you know, like getting a cow to pull or a bull to pull a plow compared to like that on its own was massive, and then mechanizing that was like colossal and enabled us to feed more people. And what happens when you make all of that stuff even more accessible, I guess, is the really interesting space to be in, and not have, you know, trade secrets or that kind of obfuscation of what that is. It's quite an interesting spot to be in.
You go, Kat.
Okay, so and now a question about the dark side, the potential dark side of this stuff. So you gave a really great example around the camera on the phone, and then a platform like Instagram, and huge impact that's had, really positive impact in a lot of ways. It's connected people, but there's also been a really dark side around this. You know,
totally.
Social media is not good for our mental health, you know, and people are only posting good things. And sometimes the bad things they post are also in like a feel sorry for me because I'm such a good person thing. Like it's quite contrived in a lot of ways. Like we're seeing massive impacts worldwide of just general unhappiness when it comes to interacting with platforms like, you know, Instagram, where people are sharing as much as they are. Even though it does also have huge benefits too. Do you see any bad or unintended consequences from like the picture that we've just painted? Like what could go wrong if there was much more of a mainstream maker culture that really tackled breaking the system of mass-produced products?
Spicy question. It's good. I think, what do I think? It's like, it's always, I always find it I'm like a natural born optimist. So I always find it quite difficult to think about, but I think inevitably, any new technology or any new sort of creation is always, I fundamentally believe people are good. And they believe they make things with the best intentions. And I think it's, you know, it's a good way for me to think, because otherwise it can just be a bit, you know, paranoid or negative about what. So, and I think people make those things. You know, I don't think Zuckerberg, and I'm not comparing myself in any way, shape, or form to like those amazingly successful sort of tech giants, but you know, I don't think when like Zuckerberg set out to make Facebook, he'd end up sort of breaking democracy, right? Like I don't think that was like, I know what I'm going to do. I think it was like a really horrendous kind of fallout from it when it gets abused, right? And I think abuse is like one of those, or like the unintended consequences of self-image on Instagram and you know, depletion of self-esteem is not something that they were intending to do at all. And I guess in a similar way, what happens when, if you imagine like make a movement on steroids where like people are, you know, it's 50 years away and it's everyone's producing their own stuff and they're like in their little communities. I guess like one really big thing is like, what does that do to the current developing economies where, you know, a lot of that economic labor is from, you know, which they're relying upon as support, when, you know, it's very easy for me to say in my bedroom flat in London to be like, yeah, I want to grow all my stuff and make all my own things. What does that do to the people in areas where they want to be able to develop? They rely on more developed economies to for their work, or, you know, for, I don't know, like any sort of farming or agriculture where, you know, like your kiwis made in grown in Italy, right? It's like still someone's livelihood. Still someone, you know, still, and it's like, maybe that's one of the things. Is it would be like, I mean, this is such a long way off as well, but it's like, but then you think about the sort of unstoppable juggernaut of automation, and that just being the opposing force to this, like the sort of monad and dyad of this, is like that's happening anyway. Right, like that's just a thing. That's just like it's like a thing, and I think that again, the pandemic has increased. It's given a lot of leeway to big companies to be like, we need to up our game on automation, and a lot of people have lost their jobs, and it's like, I don't know. It's a really funny one, isn't it? Because it's like maybe actually that it will become even more needed to be able to provide for yourself, if there's just robots doing everything else, and maybe you can't afford because I can't imagine it. They'll be like, oh, everything's autonomous now, so it's going to be cheaper. Not how it works, right? It's like, I don't think there's ever been a time when so yeah, I don't know. It's it's a huge question. I think honestly, like, sorry, Cole.
I was just thinking too about like you were talking about the things people make, and the intention that you have that people will make really good things with your device. Obviously, you guys have been given a lot of thought to, okay, well, what if people use our device to make destructive things as well? What could that look like? And where does the responsibility lie in that too?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of previous like precedent that was from the sort of 3D printing industry. You probably heard about the first 3D printed gun. That was a huge deal, because it's very much in line with that kind of like Third Amendment libertarian American values, where right to bear arms, we should be able to make our own firearms, and it was this very sort of provocative, almost like an art project, right? It was like this. There was no intention to be like, everyone can download these things now, but it was the gun itself was called the Liberator, and it's tied up. It's one of those objects that becomes entwined with the sort of cultural movements of the time, and it's like baked into that, like anti-gun law, but the reaction to that being like, well, kind of screw you, we're gonna make our own, and because of the technologies that we have accessible to us, and to an extent we've kind of come across it in a weird way already, with like one of the use cases that our very simple machine has and enables people to do is make gun holsters, and knife holsters, very, very custom, right, to your specific custom firearm. And for us, that was a moment where myself and Alex sort of sat down and said, are we okay with this? Like, do we want to be enabling people to make accessories for firearms? Because obviously it's against my personal belief system. But if people want to do it, we can't stop them. It's like we don't have digital control over these machines where we're like, we know what you're doing and no. Like we'd never host the templates, like a lot of like Thingiverse, which is the online repository for 3D files, wouldn't host the gun files for obvious reasons. Like like just weapons in general. I think it's like, but it's a really interesting side to the kind of the dark side of it, especially as like seemingly people get more and more like both atomized, and it's easy for like extremist views to be more domesticated as well. At the moment, like that seems like because internet, and the ability to sort of get into small kind of like echo chambers that perpetuate more extremist beliefs or conspiracy theories. That in combination with a more localized sort of weapon manufacture is a really scary future, right? Like that's kind of nightmarish, where it's like not only is it like enabling the kind of the indoctrination into those belief systems, but also arming them without any sort of like that's a real threat, right? Like that's a scary thing. And I think that, yeah, I mean that in answer to your question, like that could really be, it's very possible, you know. I think it's a matter of when, not if, something like that happens, right? Because you've already got, you know, the AR-15, which is like the sort of rifle of choice for a lot of the mass shootings in the States. The thing that makes that automatic as well, and also makes it harder to get, is also all like a 3D printable file. And that is just like, what? You know, how long is it going to be before that's a reality? It's
and it's funny, you know, you see, you know, your really great example about Facebook and the destruction of democracy, and seeing Mark Zuckerberg in those courthouses trying to explain how social media works. Feels like the law is just not catching up with these new spaces. These things aren't being regulated by anyone.
That's it.
And there's a real danger, isn't it? Yeah. Massively.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there, because I think particularly with sort of Silicon Valley culture and work practices, the whole thing is, you know, the delicious irony in all of this is that Zuckerberg's mantra. I mean, I did a talk at Facebook about 5 years ago and walked in, and the massive poster on the wall said "Move fast and break things."
Yeah.
And now you look back and you're like, "Ooh." But that I mean, that's the weird, you know, policy making. Just in governments in Western, it is by the definition of, like, it is slow and it is bureaucratic, and when you put that in comparison to sort of a culture of, you know, incredible speed is everything, and it's just about like minimum viable product, like all of the sort of buzzword bingo of startup culture of just like just get it out, just make it, like, ignore the rules, just like push it forward, just get it, just do it, is completely diametrically opposed again to government and how they go about like curtailing those things. It doesn't make any. They just when they clash, it's almost comical, right? It's like there are some questions fielded to Zuckerberg where it's more like, whoa, like some of the questions that are being asked are just like, no offense, but it's kind of like the digital divide incarnate, right? It's like seeing the sheer difference in understanding and of the sort of like field, and it's just very concerning, because there isn't a way. There's not like there's no enmeshing there of the two of them between sort of civil society and what sort of large tech monopolies can do and can get away with. There's not like a mechanism in place to be catching up with the speed at which they move, or the financial resource, right? Because most of them are bigger than most than like developed countries, right? It's like, in terms of like GDP, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating and terrifying both at the same time. I mean, also our ex-prime minister from the coalition government before this one is now at Facebook, right? So he's like, so Nick Clegg now works for Facebook. He's like they're basically like a PR guy, because he knows the political landscape. He knows how and Zuckerberg's probably sat there thinking, I need this guy because it's going to be an ongoing problem as the two sort of smash together more and more. Mental.
Interesting world. Wow. Interesting future.
Yeah.
So to take a step back again and reconnect with how we're saying, you know, we're kind of going full circle again. Like, we're starting to see people appreciate things being made locally, being their own maker, you know, being inventors again and creators of our own ideas. So for our listeners, what tips do you have around how they can turn their passion projects or the idea they've had in their top drawer, how they can turn that into maybe a source of income or maybe just as a hobby? Basically, like, what tips do you have for people to bring the art of play and experimentation back into their lives?
Build it.
Build it.
Just definitely. Like, you guys, I'm a huge advocate of, like, I know there's complete antithesis to what we were just saying, but not thinking about the content and just that kind of culture of just do it. But honestly, just take, even if it's a small step, every day to doing something. I personally had this problem for a long time where I would talk about ideas so much. And I had this rule, and this might not apply to everyone, but I would not talk about an idea until I had like made it real in some way. Because it almost felt like it turned into this thing where it was almost like, by talking about it, you made it real in your head or in someone else's, but because you'd be talking about it to someone else, usually be my brother. And then by talking about it, it would in some way make it real, because it becomes like a figment of the imagination and in someone else's imagination too. And then you kind of like tussle with it and think about it as a conceptual form. And then it somehow, for me anyway, I don't know if this applies to anyone else, but it would somehow demotivate me to take the next step to do it. And I think it's because I love the satisfaction of making something. But then when it almost feels like when you've almost done it by telling it to someone else, you remove that moment of like giving the people the cookies, right? Of when you're like, that's part that for me, that's so much of it is for like other people, is seeing their reaction to what it is. And I think just making something and showing it to someone, and just being ready, right? Being mentally prepared for the inevitable criticisms, and the inevitable setbacks, and just being like really open to those and using that to your advantage, and being like using that to make the next one is really, really important. And maybe it's a dead duck, right? Maybe it's just like, I know, actually, the idea of what this is in my head compared to how it actually came out is completely just not. But then sometimes it's just you do the thing, or like, even if it's a sketch, right? Like, and it's just like you show that to someone, it's like, that's actually really cool. But have you thought about this little thing? And then it's like, yeah, just little steps forward. I think is absolutely key. Not just anything to make it slightly more tangible. For me, it's just like, or if it's like a web product, you know, it's just getting a sketch of on a piece of paper of what it looks like, right? And just like even that, and just showing that to people. Yeah, just anything to move it forward, but just building it and not being precious about it, being like, yeah, I mean, I could tell you I can tell you this now, but like Projectio, when we did that Kickstarter, the prototype that we used in that film was just like, I didn't have a clue how to make it. Do you know what I mean? It was just, it was sort of hacked together out of like blue tack and like 3D printed cases and LEDs that I'd stolen from a torch, and just, like all of that kind of stuff. And it was like, just kind of wing it. And then all of the fun is sort of, because I think it kind of goes back to that thing as well about getting validation for those things. And there's a certain amount of validation you can do for yourself by it just being something that is exciting and satisfying for you to do, even from a mental standpoint as well. Like drawing for me is like, it's like a form of kind of meditation and self-reflection, like just doodling and just like coming up with ideas. It's just, and that's also fine, right? Just making stuff for your own sake of making stuff. It doesn't need to be like the next iPhone.
Yeah.
It's just, it's okay for stuff just to be like, that's really fun to make. I'm just going to do that. Yeah, they're the ideas that I love.
I love it.
Really
like
fun.
A moment in time,
Exactly.
Yeah, so good.
So Ben, where can our listeners find you?
London. No. So on the interwebs, Mayku is at Team Mayku on the gram and on the Twitters. My personal account is at Ben Redford 2 on the Twitter. Yeah, and then just take a look at the stuff and see what you guys think. And if you've got any questions, then drop me a line.
That's really, really awesome. We're excited to see your new features for Boombox come out. So that'll be really interesting. We just want to say thank you so much for spending your morning with us and our evening with us today.
Pleasure. I really enjoyed it. It was a really great chat.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, like focusing on imagination and creativity, as well as, what's wrong with the system and how, like, the value of objects, I think, to me was really big in this chat we had today. And thinking about Angie's dad with the knife handle and trying to find a use for it brings me such joy. So thank you so much for spending time with us today, Ben.
My pleasure, and thank you both so much. Thank you so much for the time and the conversation, and the preparation, and the organisation that you did. It's been absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed myself.
That was so fun.
Fun.
That was such a great conversation with Ben. I really enjoyed learning about how much manufacturing has changed, but also not changed, because manufacturing at home has always been a thing as well. What I loved so much was reflecting on how the stuff that we make helps us create connections with other people, especially if it's things that we make for others. It's less about what we make, but really about what the thought behind it that counts. Even if it's ugly and even if it's uneven, it's that part of it that is something that we enjoy more than the actual thing. Like a wooden spoon. You're not going to use it because it's functional, but you'll use it because you appreciate it, because someone had made it for you or colored it in for you, and that will always have a story behind it.
Absolutely. It's almost like that. There's that human touch that's part of the gift or the thing that someone's made for you, and there's that warmth of that person. It's almost like they're a part of you. When you're using the wooden spoon, for example, you think of that person who gifted you the spoon, which is really nice.
Yeah. So our object's just a way for us to connect with each other without seeing them, like without having you next to me, having something from you. Yeah. But how does that all work when we just buy stuff that's made overseas?
Exactly, exactly. And you know what that makes me think is another really big theme was that importance of diversity. So when you think of all these things being made overseas and mass production, everything starts to feel and look the same. I'm on the IKEA mug, right? IKEA mug, whether it's in my kitchen here in Melbourne or in my friend's kitchen in Germany, it's always going to look the same. And it doesn't have that sense of diversity or that human touch associated with it. And I think it's one of those things where we need to remember the importance of diversity and how this creativity that comes out of our the things that we have in our homes and the things we choose to interact with. It's an opportunity for people to express their culture, their background, points of view, their opinions, their concerns. Everything becomes a piece of art that way.
Yeah. It's funny though, in the episode with Ben, we were talking about like this new hipster gentrification movement of making things, these artisanal pottery, plates and mugs and cups that we love to own and make, and how that's, we're seeing more diversity come through there. But in chatting to Harriet, one of our teammates, she was like, hold on a second. I can go into Kmart and find that exact thing on the shelf, but in mass production.
It's, basically what we're seeing here is a standardization of diversity, which is so inauthentic, because then how do you know, right? Have you just bought the Kmart version? Or is it actually the authentic mug that was created through fine craftsmanship and, utilizing the best resources or fine resources from your local area? And it's almost becomes craftsmanship on the cheap. And
how would you know?
How do you know, right? It's And you know what that reminds me of is the conversation we had with Layla a couple of episodes ago around status symbols, like a big coffee cup. And I'm wondering now whether we are starting to see that status symbol come through to kind of signal, hey, I can afford artisanal pottery, cutlery, crockery in my home, rather than the bulk IKEA or Kmart set. That will cost me a lot less money and is more around function than about, form and beauty.
Yes, even though it is from there, but you just don't know it is, right?
Exactly.
The thing that I also loved about chatting with Ben was there's a spirit to maker culture, and that is making things transparent. The belief that if that fundamental belief that he had around like valuing the things at home, being able to make from what you have, and how the maker culture is one of being able to share the blueprints for how to make things on your own, in your own homes. Anyone can make stuff. And one of the biggest kind of open source events that happened, most recently was Elon Musk publishing his, all the plans to make everything that you would need to make Tesla cars. And that was a really big deal. I remember everyone was like, oh, I can't believe he's done this. What a cool guy. He's not precious about his IP, but actually what he was doing is helping people create a new system to support these types of vehicles. However, in that space, cars have been made since the 20s, and there's regulations around how cars need to be made. There's safety measures. But in, the maker space of making things at home, there aren't those regulations. Government hasn't yet caught up. We see that the same thing's happening with social media, and there can be some huge unintended consequences when it comes to allowing different types of people to be able to have access to, the stuff that you create that you may have a really good intentions for, but used to manipulate or used in really bad ways. So it's an interesting conundrum.
Isn't it? It really is. It's like what we're trying to create here is a community of innovators or a community of creators, but then that information can be misused or abused, which is tricky and a little bit sad to see, of course. Yeah. The other thing, though, that reminds me of is another big thing that came up in our conversation with Ben is this notion of being more resourceful and working with what we have, right?
Yeah.
Like Ben was saying, we'll find a way, we'll make it work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, for some reason, it feels like we've lost our connection to imagination. And I'm talking about us as like adults, you know, like it's been drummed out of us at school. And we've lost this inner drive just to be creative. And what I find is really interesting is that there's like a mindset and approach that we've lost connection with, now that we've become adults, we've lost the ability to imagine and be playful. And we've also, by doing that at the same time, we've also lost our resourcefulness because there's just stuff everywhere and you can just go and keep on buying stuff and it's available 24/7. I wonder if those two things go hand in hand.
I think so too. I think it's one of those things where like I'm wondering, has it made us arrogant? Has it made us narrow-minded? And we start to see constraints as something bad. Well, I think what Ben was trying to remind us was that constraints are actually really good. Constraints help us spark our creativity. And it is about allowing our inner intuition, which is programmed around survival and making things work. I think it's reigniting that a little bit, that we need to learn how to improvise again and how to avoid this, you know, it's too hard, I might as well just go buy something new, or I might as well avoid this type of problem solving. Maybe it's like a type of problem solving that we've lost touch with, because it's too hard and it's probably easier just to, like I said, go out and buy something instead.
Yeah, like your dad with a knife handle.
Exactly, you know, love it. What a genius.
And it's basically, you know, Ben's story about constraints and starting small is what Tammy was saying back in episode 1, which is just take a step, just start going, be persistent with your idea, don't be too precious about it and take the small steps to get you going. And the thing that you will get, even if you fail, is the gift of learning. You will learn through the process of just taking a small step, you know, experimenting with something really small and making things tangible and making things real. And, you know, we couldn't really put it better in the way that he did with, you know, stop talking, just start doing, start sketching, start building, and just get on with it.
Exactly. So on that note, given today's theme, right, of creativity, bringing ideas to life, to actually start doing things, Kat and I decided to take action. And we decided that it is time for us to actually take on board some of these learnings, especially a lot of the things that we got out of today's conversation. So Kat and I have decided to take on micro challenges, which is a way for us to take action and apply what we've learned today and apply it to our everyday life. So our little micro challenges are something we're going to be doing throughout the course of the month. You're going to be able to follow us on social media to see how we're tracking as well. I know Ben, he set a challenge up for himself at the end of our conversation. He was saying, you know, it was so good. He was talking about, you know, don't talk about it, start building it, talk to someone about it. He was saying, I want to be able to talk to someone about my idea. I want to bring it to life. I'm going to make it real. I'm going to sketch it out. I'm going to build it rather than talking about what this potential idea is going to be. And not to be precious about it too, which I think is a really good reminder, part of that and as part of a challenge like this. So, Kat, tell me, what is your micro challenge that you're going to take up?
Okay, so my micro challenge is really, really micro. It's not like a big thing. I haven't talked too much about it, which is actually the point as well. So if anyone else out there wants to do this challenge with us, I advise you to do what I've done. And that's basically like just go with the smallest thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sketch noting my meetings. I really miss, like in this Zoom life that a lot of us are living through, I really miss getting in touch with a pen and paper. And I found that when I doodle, which is something Ben was talking about as well, like it just lets my mind wander and think, and I can come back to a conversation having done a bit more thinking on the side. So I will be posting my beautifully glorious meeting notes on Instagram as part of my challenge this month. What about you, Angie? What are you going to do?
Well, you know what? The one thing, not the one thing, but the main thing that resonated with me out of this chat was resourcefulness and how we've lost touch with that. And given that we're spending so much time at home at the moment, and my husband and I have created a new ritual of having a really nice sit-down breakfast because cafes have been closed all this time.
Yeah.
We create this beautiful sit-down breakfast at home, and we buy a fresh loaf of bread to celebrate the moment. But it also means we have a lot of stale bread sitting.
Yeah.
And usually what we end up doing is there's a bit of stale bread left and I'll just chuck it in the compost, right? So now my challenge I want to do is to not chuck out that piece of bread, but make something with it.
Cool.
Like, croutons, breadcrumbs,
Nice.
pancetta, I don't know, all of the things. So this is also a shout out to our community. I need your help. Send me your stale bread tips, tricks, and recipes.
Do it. Yes.
Tag me, use the hashtag The Invention Podcast on Instagram so that I can see that as well and help me out on the micro challenge.
That's awesome. Can't wait to see what you do and how creative you be. Like, if I see by the end of the month that you have like little mini bread snowmen, I will be so happy.
It's going to be so good.
Well, that's a wrap from us. The Reinvention Podcast is produced by Make Studios. Make Studios is an innovation company helping organizations, teams, and individuals thrive in times of change.
We partner with bold leaders looking to reinvent systems and organizations to create a better world. Reach out if you're keen to work with us. You can find our podcast and much more on our website at makestudios.com.au/learn or makestudios.asia/learn. And a big special thanks to Ben for joining us on the show today.
Till next time, keep reinventing.